Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. It's Samuel Allred here, and it's that time of year where it's starting to get a little bit colder. And when it's not just flat out cold, it is cold and wet. And so I thought this would be the perfect time of year to talk a little bit about layering. Now, layering is a simple concept, but sometimes it's helpful to get some examples and kind of understand what other people are doing with their layers to help you know what to do when you're dressing for your next hunt, or going skiing, or going hiking, or whatever it is. So I wanted to provide some examples and kind of tell you a little bit of the theory behind layering to help you out. This time of year is especially challenging for me because where I live, often it is raining and I'm hunting in weather that's around 40 degrees and wet, right? So just on the verge of being cold enough to get some ice and snow, but not cold enough to dry out. You know, sometimes hunting in snow is easier than hunting in rain. And in that temperature range around 40 degrees, getting some rain can create a dangerous situation because you get a little bit wet and then it's around 40 degrees, which is like a refrigerator, right? And all of a sudden you can feel really, really cold. Not to mention some wind chill in there. And you can find yourself in a dangerous situation pretty quickly. So what I've settled on so far, just with the layers that I have, is a moisture wicking base layer, so top and bottom, a synthetic waffle fleece quarter zip that I wear on top. And that's nice because it's kind of a lightweight layer still. I can unzip it if I'm getting hot, but if it's cold, but I still want to be active, I can wear that. And it's not holding in too much moisture. And then for when I sit down and wait, I throw on a heavy synthetic water resistant jacket that has some heavy synthetic fill. And that synthetic fill keeps me warm even if it gets wet. So as long as I'm not out there for a couple days in a row, it's fine if that jacket gets wet, and then I can let it dry out, and then I come back out and hunt the next day. On the bottom, I'm wearing sort of a synthetic hunting pant. They're from First Light, and I wear them for all my hunting. So those hunting pants go over my base layer on the bottom. And then I've got some vented rain pants. And I will wear those for rain, for a little bit of warmth even, and for walking through wet brush. I actually find those super helpful for walking through wet brush, even when it's not raining. So that's pretty much what I've settled on for these types of conditions. However, if I was out for multiple days in a row, my main, synthetic jacket getting wet wouldn't be that great. So what I would like to do is upgrade to a zip-up fleece and a lightweight rain shell. And I think that would kind of give me the best of both worlds, because the zip-up fleece, you can unzip it to let heat out. Zipped up, it should be pretty warm. And then that rain shell, I can put it on if it's raining hard, and it should keep me completely dry, assuming it doesn't wet out, instead of getting wet and heavy and potentially not being dry the next time I need to wear it. So that's just an example of what we're going to talk about today. It's something that's on my mind constantly, and I'm still refining it, but that's kind of what I've landed on for right now. And we'll talk more about this stuff in the podcast today. Before we get into it, if you enjoy this podcast, if you've learned something new, please take a moment to follow the podcast on whatever platform you listen on, maybe leave a comment, and especially share an episode with a friend. That will help the podcast grow and in turn help more people get outside and into hunting, which is what Persistence Outdoors is all about. So thank you to everybody who listens and supports the podcast. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, I'm bringing you helpful information every week. And with that, let's continue with our topic for today. All right, so I've already given you a real life example of layering, but I want to talk about what the goals of layering are. Why do we do it in the first place? And why is layering preferable to just wearing a big heavy jacket that combines your insulation and waterproofing and all of that all in one? And there's a couple reasons why we might layer instead of just wearing one big jacket or instead of wearing just one insulated pair of pants. The first big reason is temperature regulation. So when you're out, and especially when you're being active, you are going to experience all sorts of different temperatures. Maybe you go out in the early morning before the sun has come up and you hike out a ways. Well, it's going to be cold, but you're going to be hiking, so you're going to be a little bit warm. But then you stop and sit down to wait for animals to come by. And all of a sudden, it's still cold and you're not moving, and you are going to be cold if you don't have something to put on, right? Simple. But then the sun comes up and now it's a little bit warmer. And maybe you need to shed a layer at that point. Or maybe you need to move stands and you're hiking again and you're going to be warm. So having different layers that you can take off or put on is really helpful just to keep your temperature at a comfortable level. Another big reason for layering is moisture management. So that includes wicking sweat, preventing sweat or preventing sweating, keeping water out, and letting moisture out. And this all ties back into temperature regulation, but it's also a comfort thing too. Preferably, you won't be sopping wet the whole time you're outdoors in the rain. So wicking sweat, that's what your base layer does. That helps keep you warm and comfortable. Preventing sweating just means that you're wearing the right amount of clothing for the activity that you're doing. There's this idea of being comfortably cold, and it's when you're dressed just right so that you're a little chilly, but once you start moving around, you're not going to start sweating excessively. The problem with lots of sweat is that in cold weather, if you're sweating a lot, and then you stop creating body heat by moving around, you'll be wet. And whenever you're wet, you have a higher likelihood of becoming cold quickly. So generally, you want to sweat as little as possible, especially in cold weather. Now, there's the aspect of keeping water out. So this would be your rain gear or some other sort of shell. Maybe it's just a rain-resistant layer on your jacket, and then letting water out. Not only is it important that you can shed rain, but you also need to be able to let that moisture from your sweat out so that it doesn't accumulate in your clothing and make you cold. So the whole moisture management side of things is very important when it comes to layering. And one great reason why you might choose to layer instead of just using one big heavy jacket. With a good layering system, you also get a lot of customizability. So let's say you're going on a warm weather hunt. Well, if you have the right layers, you can just take out a layer and go on that hunt. And then later, when you're going on a colder weather hunt, you can just add back in a layer. But those separate pieces should work together even if you remove the insulation layer, for example. If you only had a big heavy jacket, instead of having a fleece and a rain jacket, and then you wanted to go on a warm weather hunt, well, your big heavy jacket isn't going to do the trick because it's just going to be too warm anytime you put it on. But if you have a fleece and a rain jacket, well, maybe you could lose the fleece and just wear your base layer and the rain jacket on your warm weather hunt in the case that it rains, and you'll be just fine. So you have all this customizability where you can mix and match layers and get a little bit more use out of them than specialized single pieces of gear. So the most common layering system that you'll hear about is the 3-layer system. So you're going to have a base layer, a mid or insulation layer, and an outer layer or shell. And by choosing different thicknesses or different materials of each of these layers, you can have proper layering for all sorts of different scenarios. So a base layer is usually going to be some sort of synthetic or wool, fairly tight layer next to skin. And usually it is wicking moisture and then adding some warmth. For cold weather, you just wear a thicker base layer. For warmer weather or medium temperature weather, you just wear a thinner one. Your mid layer is going to provide some sort of insulation. So again, this could be a thin waffle fleece, a quarter zip, or even a hoodie, or it could be a thick, puffy down jacket, or something in between, like just a fleece, a pile fleece with a zipper. It could be a wool hoodie, something like that. So anything that gives you insulation and just the right amount of insulation for however cold it's going to be. And then the outer layer is going to be something that protects you from the wind and rain. And so sometimes it might not be important to have full rain gear or a hard shell. Other times it will be, but this outer layer can take different forms. So if you've got a very warm fleece or a very warm puffy jacket, for the outer layer, all you might need is a rain jacket that can fit comfortably over your insulation layer. Now, if it's very, very cold or your insulation layer is kind of light, you might still want an outer layer that has some insulation, but also has some sort of shell material that's going to cut the wind and protect you from some rain. So they can all take different shapes and forms, but the principle is the same. Usually you'll have a base layer, a mid layer, and an outer layer. Now, again, in real life, it might look a little different. It's not always going to be 3 layers. In the past, I've found myself wearing a base layer, a waffle fleece quarter zip, a light down jacket, and then a shell material jacket over that. So that's 4 layers, but it's what I had and it worked okay. So let's walk through more examples of different scenarios and what you might wear. So let's say it's hot weather. Maybe it's 70 to 80 degrees when you're hunting out in the early season. What are you going to wear? Well, start with a short sleeve t-shirt, right? Pretty simple. Lightweight pants. When I'm hunting, I like to have pants on. If you were just hiking, maybe you would wear shorts. And then on top, you might want a lightweight rain jacket in case there's a squall, or maybe just some other sort of lightweight jacket that will give you a little protection from wind and rain if it happens to come by, but it's not taking up too much space in your pack. And then finally, if it gets colder when the sun goes down, you might want a mid layer like a fleece jacket or a lightweight down jacket. But really, you don't need to wear that much because it's pretty warm And if you're moving around at all, it's actually more about staying cool than trying to keep yourself warm. Now, let's go to the other extreme. Let's say it's cold, dry weather. It's around 20 degrees. So instead of raining, it's only going to snow. Well, I would start out with thick wool base layers. So you can get a surprising amount of warmth out of your base layers. And they're also going to wick moisture, which helps keep you warm and comfortable. You can start with something like a 250 gram wool base layer, and that will keep you surprisingly warm. And you will still have room to put on layers over that. So don't forget your base layer. It's super important. Over your base layer, you will want something that's seriously insulating. So in cold, dry weather like that, I would go for a down jacket. It's so cold that if there's any precipitation, it's likely going to be snow. So you don't have to worry about getting your down wet. And down just has the best warmth to weight ratio of pretty much anything. So a nice down jacket. You could even get down puffy pants. They make those. And if you're going to be sitting somewhere for a long time, maybe consider some down puffy pants. You will need a shell that fits over everything you're wearing on top. So this could have a little insulation, but if your down jacket is doing its job, you probably won't need much insulation in your shell. This could be like a rain jacket. It could be sort of like a ski jacket construction, and it just goes over everything. And you want to make sure that it's big enough to fit over your down jacket while still allowing that down to loft. So it needs to be pretty big. Now, for your pants, pants are tricky because they're hard to take on and off while you're wearing boots. I call it the pants problem, right? So if I'm going to tolerate being a little bit either sweaty or even a little bit cold, it's more likely going to be on my legs than on my torso. So in very cold weather, you might opt for some insulated pants and then just aggressively strip your top layers if you're going to be active and generating a lot of body heat. I think that's kind of the best way to do it because otherwise you're trying to take off an insulation layer over your boots, and that can just be tricky. Now, one thing that I found is that with something like rain gear, like shell pants that are made to go on over other pants easily, they'll have big side zips or something that can go over your boots. Those can add a little bit of warmth, and they also protect you from moisture. So sometimes I will throw on my shell pants over my hunting pants just for a little bit of extra thermal regulation. And it's not a lot. It's also not ideal when you're walking around because they can trap moisture. But sometimes if I'm just going to be glassing somewhere and it's windy, those shell pants can be just enough to keep me a little bit more comfortable. And then finally, if it's really, really cold, you might include another layer on top. You might use a quarter zip fleece or a hoodie or something like that. And it doesn't hurt to add an extra layer besides the fact that it's going to make it a little bit more bulky. The last example I've got is rainy weather, which we talked about in the intro. But let's say it's not particularly cold. Let's say it's just rainy and windy, but not in the 35 to 40 degree range. Well, I've found myself wearing my base layers in rain gear before, and it's kind of a weird combo. It's not always the most comfy feeling, but sometimes that's all I need to stay warm enough and then also keep the rain out. If you're hiking though, sometimes having rain gear on when you're hiking isn't a good option because it accumulates moisture. And just like it keeps water out, it keeps water in. And so sometimes it's just better to have something breathable, like a soft shell jacket. A fleece isn't ideal because it's going to suck up a lot of water, But something like a soft shell jacket that will repel some water but is still breathable, that can be a really good option when you're trying to be active in rain. And as long as you can dry out at some point, you'll pretty much be fine. And if the jacket is synthetic, even if you get a little bit wet, you can still stay decently warm. I was just talking about my rain pants that I sometimes put on over my other pants and over my boots. I've found that sometimes it's easier to hike with my synthetic, breathable hiking pants, a base layer, and then gaiters instead of my rain pants, because my rain pants will quickly become hot and collect moisture. But if I have gaiters on, it protects my lower leg from getting completely soaked in wet brush or even snow, but my legs can still breathe above the knee. And so it's just enough breathability mixed with just enough protection to keep me comfortable, even in snowy conditions, or sometimes even in light on and off rain, where I'm more worried about getting wet from the brush than from the rain coming down. I actually did a deep dive on all of this in episode 26. It's called Moisture Management and Rain Jackets. It kind of explains your different options for staying dry or getting dry. It also talks about rain jackets and their limitations. A lot of rain jackets say that they're breathable, but you can only be so breathable if you're also keeping water out. So I go really into detail in that episode. I found it helpful just researching for that episode, and I think you'll find it helpful too if you're trying to figure out how to deal with rain in the most effective way possible. All right, let's talk about different materials that your layers might be made out of. So first off, we have synthetics. Synthetics are usually lightweight. They tend to be breathable. They can keep you warm even when they get wet, which is a big advantage of synthetics. They dry quickly, they're durable, and they're usually inexpensive compared to natural materials. So synthetics are a great option for outdoors clothing. Now, personally, I don't like synthetics that much for two reasons. One, they can get really stinky. It's not all synthetics, but some synthetics, you wear them once and they start to smell bad, or you sweat a little and they start to smell bad right away. And I really don't enjoy that, especially when I'm hunting for a couple days and I don't want to just smell bad after day one. So I tend to avoid synthetics for that reason. Another reason is that they're basically made of plastic, and there's lots of concerns about microplastics being in everything. You obviously can't avoid it completely, but I would like to minimize my exposure if I can. And then also, I can't get over the idea of something that just never goes away. And at some point, we're going to have so much trash and plastic, right? That's just never going to go away unless we find a way to get rid of it. So I like to avoid synthetics for those reasons. However, I still will wear some synthetics, and especially for my specialized outdoors gear. It's not all of my clothing, right? It's for some things that I'm going to use over and over. It gives me the advantages that I need. And sometimes I'm just going to opt for synthetics because they're simply the best option available. Now, another material that you will commonly find in outdoors clothing is wool. Wool is great because it can also keep you warm when it's wet. It won't be completely warm, but it's warmer than something like cotton. It also doesn't feel clammy. Some people wear synthetics, and when it gets a little bit wet, it can feel wet on your skin, but wool tends to wick away the moisture a little bit more, and it doesn't feel kind of cold and slick on your skin the way some synthetics can. I like wool because it's natural and sustainable. We can always grow more wool on sheep and it will biodegrade. And then also, it's great because it's antimicrobial and less stinky than synthetics. So, a wool base layer is a great way to stay feeling fresh even when you've been out hunting for a couple days. You might sweat in it a little bit, you might get some dirt on you, but you're not going to smell that bad because of those antimicrobial properties. So, wool is a great option, especially for your next to skin layers. Now, some disadvantages of wool are that it can be heavy compared to synthetics. It can be expensive, especially if you want to find sort of a finer, less itchy, softer wool. It can be a little bit expensive, and it's not always as durable as synthetic clothing. Often you will find wool blend clothing, and be warned, that usually means it's like 80% polyester, like 15% wool, and then a little bit of spandex or something. But sometimes you'll find wool blend clothing that is made to be a little bit more durable. And that's one way wool can be sort of the primary material, but still have the durable properties of synthetics. But if you find something that's like 100% wool, you do have to treat it a little bit more carefully, and it may wear out sooner than synthetic materials. And then finally, I alluded to this, but wool can be itchy. So some people find it a little bit uncomfortable. Personally, I found a lot of synthetic clothing to be uncomfortable. It feels abrasive to me, so I rather the slight itchiness, which I usually get over, than the sort of abrasive synthetic feeling. But just depending on what you're wearing, that could be an issue. Now, a third material that is very common in outdoors clothing is down. And down has some properties that no other materials have. It has the highest warmth to weight ratio of any of these materials. So you could have a jacket that has a down fill or a synthetic fill, or even like some sort of wool garment that's pretty thick and meant to be insulating. Down is just going to blow them out of the water when it comes to the warmth to weight ratio. The nature of down is that it's lofty, right? All those feathers arrange themselves in a way that traps a bunch of air. And all those feathers are also very light. And I'm calling them feathers. It's actually down, which is slightly different than feather, but you know what I mean. So the more loft that the down can create, the higher the warmth potential. And it's actually kind of the same way with synthetics and with wool, but I think it's just a little bit more obvious when you're using down. So super high warmth to weight ratio. It's somewhat natural in the sense that it comes from ducks, right? Ducks or geese. Now, usually down jackets are still made with a synthetic fabric because that light synthetic fabric helps to keep the garment lightweight, and it also allows the down to loft in a way that maybe a heavier fabric wouldn't do as well. So most down jackets that you're going to buy are a mix of synthetic and natural materials. Now, the one big problem with down is that it doesn't dry very quickly. So if it gets wet, it will lose its loft and it won't keep you warm. And it's not going to dry out anytime soon. And so that's a huge risk if you're wearing down clothing and you don't have a way to keep it dry. Modern down is often coated with something like a Nikwax hydrophobic coating. And so they found ways to make modern down jackets much more water resistant and less sort of particular when it comes to moisture. So if you're looking for something that you don't want to worry about, but you still want the advantages of down, you could look for something like that. If you want to learn more about down, go check out episode 19. It's called Deciphering Down. And in that episode, I talk about fill power, fill weight, and everything else you need to know when choosing a down garment. So I thought that was a great episode, and it may be helpful for you to better understand and be able to compare different down jackets and even sleeping bags and things like that. Now, one material you might want to avoid is cotton. You'll often hear people say cotton kills. And that's because cotton, when it gets wet, no longer keeps you warm and it doesn't dry out quickly. So let's say you're wearing jeans and you're out and it rains a little bit. Well, your jeans might be wet for the rest of the day. And when they're wet, they're not going to keep you warm. And so that's the reasoning behind the phrase cotton kills. You'll especially see it when someone goes out with cotton base layers. So let's say they're wearing a cotton t-shirt or even cotton underwear, cotton socks, something like that. And then they get a little bit wet because it's raining out or because they're sweating. And then they stop moving and all of a sudden they start to get cold. And in extreme cases, that could lead to hypothermia. So you want to be really careful with cotton. Personally, sometimes I do wear cotton when it's warm out. I find cotton to be pretty comfortable, and if it's hot, I don't mind sweating a little bit. Doesn't look great, but sweat does cool you down, and so I'm not worried about the cotton not drying out quickly. It's fine, and I like the breathability of it. So sometimes in warm weather, I will wear cotton. Sometimes a light layer of cotton is just the most breathable and comfortable thing to wear. But in cold weather, you really need to be careful with it, and I generally avoid it. Okay, so the material of your clothing is important, but the design is also important. When you're thinking about layering, zippers are your friend because you can unzip to let heat and moisture out. You can zip up to stay warmer. And just having that option and that versatility is really helpful. Then you can also wear layers, multiple layers, and maybe you don't have to take off an entire layer when you get warm. You just unzip, and you could unzip a couple zippers in a row, and then you have some skin or you have your base layer exposed, right? So zippers can be very helpful. Along with zippers, I would look for vents on rain jackets. I think if you're wearing rain gear and you have to be active, venting is the best way to avoid moisture buildup on the inside. So some pit zips are going to be really helpful and a great design feature to have in your layering system. Now, there's always the question of whether you want a hood or not. I can go either way when it comes to warmth. Generally, though, I don't like hoods, and there's two reasons. Number one is when I'm hunting, wearing a hood always creates a lot of noise around my ears. You hear the just all the time. And I've even been sitting still, but got excited and just heard the sound of my blood pumping through my head. It must have been through my ears, I guess. And it just made this rhythmic sound in my ears that kind of sounded like animals behind me. And so I'm like hearing this noise in my ears, and then I get excited again, and then I look around and I see nothing, and it was just really annoying. So I prefer to get my warmth for my head from a hat that sticks to my head and it doesn't create swishing noises. Now, the second thing is sometimes when hoods don't fit well, they can kind of weigh the whole jacket down on your head, and it makes your neck tired and kind of can make you tense. And I don't like that feeling, so I prefer not to have it. The only thing that I would definitely have a hood on is a rain jacket. And other than that, I prefer to just, use a buff around my neck or even a scarf or something and a knit hat for some warmth on my head. And then if I really need it, if it's raining, I'll put on that rain jacket hood and be good to go. And then finally, you have to consider the fit of your layers. Especially with a rain jacket, it needs to fit over everything. I have a big puffy jacket that is very warm and I love it, but my rain jacket, the way that the hood is cut, it doesn't completely cover that puffy jacket. And so it's not completely exposed, but if I was in a lot of rain and I was trying to wear my rain jacket over my puffy jacket, there's a chance that my puffy could get wet. And then, as we talked about, it wouldn't keep me as warm. So as you're layering, think about how everything is going to fit over each other, and even test it out before you get ready for a hunt. Put on all 3 of your layers and see if they fit over each other. And sometimes this means you're going to need a larger outer layer than you might expect, but you will appreciate the size when it covers your insulation layer and keeps you dry, and also when it allows you to move freely. All right, guys. Well, I think that's about it for today. I hope this has demystified layering for you, or at least given you something to think about. Before I go, I want to direct you to a resource online that can help you get an idea of what sort of layers you might need for an upcoming hunt. So if you go to the First Light website, First Light is a clothing brand for hunters. It's got a lot of good gear. I have a couple pieces of First Light clothing, but I'm not affiliated with them in any way. If you go to their website, they have a number of recommended kits. And if you scroll down and find it, it will say something like mid-season whitetail or Western rifle. And so you can find the kit that matches the type of hunt that you're going to go on and click into it. And it has all of their products that they recommend for that type of hunt. So if you're new to this, or if you're going on a hunt that you haven't been on before, this is a super useful tool. Obviously, you don't need every single thing they suggest, and you also don't need to buy from First Light particularly. There are going to be other outdoors brands out there that make great gear that are going to be less expensive, but it gives you an idea of the type of clothing that you might want to wear or look for your specific hunt. Also, by the way, this makes a great gift guide of sorts. If you're looking for a gift for a hunter and you know that they do a certain type of hunting, you could go use this to find some gear that they might enjoy. Just an FYI with the holidays coming up. So I think that's pretty cool. It's obviously a tactic to sell more gear, but it can be useful and it's worth checking out. With that, I will wrap this up. Stay warm, everybody, and I will catch you on the next one.